All right, well, it's 6 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's presentations for 596A. We have 5 speakers that are presenting on a vast array of topics. So first up, we have Matt Martin, who will be speaking to us tonight on a project titled A GIS Approach to Coral Reef Restoration Site Selection. So Matt, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay. Well, my name is Matt Martin. My project is a GIS approach to coral reef restoration site selection. So to understand how to choose ideal locations for coral reef restoration, you first need to understand corals and how they create coral reefs. So corals are animals, not plants. Some people are unaware of that fact. They're in the phylum Cnidaria, the same phylum as anemones and jellyfish. They consist of colonies of polyps with symbiotic algae known as zooxanthellae within their tissues. This algae undergoes photosynthesis and shares its food product with its host. These polyps take in nutrients from food and seawater to build up their calcium carbonate skeletons, and these hard skeletons accumulate over time to create coral reefs. So coral reef ecosystems primarily occur in tropical environments. There are a few that occur in temperate areas, but those are typically non-photosynthetic deep water corals. For this analysis, I'm focused on the tropical corals. Coral reefs are one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems on the planet. They provide approximately 25% of marine species depend on coral reefs for food or shelter, habitat, a number of different things. Coral reefs also provide over $3.4 billion in value to the US economy every year. Around 500 million people worldwide depend on coral reefs for food, income, and coastal protection. This is an image here of just showing how coral reefs help to provide a buffer between waves and the shore. So it can help to reduce the impact that hurricanes have on the land. Some of the physical requirements for coral reefs include low turbidity and sediment input, stable open ocean salinity, stable temperature, low nutrients, and high light. Turbidity, sedimentation, and nutrient input is considered the most important factors, though stability of water parameters is also very important. There are many threats to coral reefs. These include increasing ocean temperatures from global warming, ocean acidification also as a result of global warming, coral diseases, overfishing, invasive species, coastal development, which can in turn cause pollution, runoff, and erosion. Natural events such as storms can also severely damage coral reefs. Reefs can recover on their own from such events. However, increasing stressors are compounding with these events to reduce the reef's ability to recover naturally. There's a few different restoration methods that have been developed over the years. The most common method is called coral farming or gardening. Healthy wild coral colonies are clipped and the fragments are grown into coral nurseries. Once these fragments grow to a sufficient size, the coral colonies are then outplanted into degraded reefs. Other methods involve collecting coral gametes during spawning events and growing them into larvae, then seeding the degraded reefs with the larvae. Though these methods frequently produce less results in terms of overall survivability. There's a number of challenges to coral reef restoration. One big one is a lack of scientific input. Most restoration projects are undertaken by nonprofit groups and volunteers who don't always have access to the most recent up-to-date scientific information. There's also a bit of a debate on the effectiveness of restoration efforts. Some believe that restoration efforts take attention away from solving the causes of coral degradation in the first place, things like climate change. They argue if you don't correct the underlying problem, then what's the point? You're going to lose the reef regardless. Those in favor of coral reef restoration counter that restoration efforts help to sustain reefs long enough for the broader issues to be corrected. They say that if we don't do anything, then we're definitely going to lose the coral reefs. So we might as well do something to save what we can. Another major issue is time and financial investment. Coral reef restoration is very expensive and time consuming, often more so than other ecosystems. Lack of genetic variability in the outplanted corals is another major problem. The coral fragments are genetically identical to their parent colony. So if coral fragments aren't genetically diverse, then natural sexual reproduction becomes impossible, and the reef will lose its ability to adapt to future stressors. Coral diseases are another major concern in reef restoration because they can be spread rapidly within a coral nursery and wipe out the collected fragments. Coral diseases are a particular problem in the Caribbean. And the image here is of a diseased coral. So the primary objectives of this project are to develop a GIS-focused approach to reef restoration, site selection, and to enhance coral reef restoration efforts in the Florida Keys by selecting locations for restoration that provide the highest likelihood for coral outplant survival. The area of focus for this project is the Florida Keys due to the abundant geographic data available for the region, though the method should be applicable to any geographic region. This is Acropora cervicornis, one of the two major reef-building coral species found in the Caribbean. And then Acropora palmata, the other primary reef-building species. The data I'll use for this analysis includes sea surface temperature, hydrology, ocean currents, land use, bathymetry, and seafloor substrate. For sea surface temperature, I've collected a spreadsheet of data, a subset of which you can see here. With this data, I will create a point layer in ArcMap, and then I'll run an interpolation function to create a raster that will cover the extent of the Florida Keys. Terrestrial hydrology will be used as a measure of sedimentation. Rivers, streams, and canals will be buffered to reduce zones of high sedimentation risk. Ocean currents will be incorporated to account for the spread of sediment throughout the ocean as well. The ocean current data will be the trickiest to incorporate into the analysis due to how currents interact with hydrology and land use to spread sediment. They also carry coral gametes and larvae to other reefs, potentially seeding degraded reefs along their path. So they can have both a positive and a negative effect on a restoration site. Land use will be used in two primary ways. First, agriculture areas will be used as a measure of sedimentation. waterways that run through agricultural areas will be given a larger buffer distance to account for the larger sedimentation that they will collect. Residential and commercial areas will also be buffered to reduce proximity to human activity. Bathymetry data will be used to select areas between 1 and 20 meters in depth, which is the natural range for the Caribbean acropora. The natural range of Acropora palmata is up to 5 meters, and Acropora cervicornis's natural range is up to 20 meters. So a 1 to 20 meters depth range should cover both species. Data on the seafloor substrate will be used to select areas with ideal benthic habitat. Acropora require solid rocky substrate for anchoring and support. Loose substrates reduce coral stability and increase the risk of damage and burial during storms. Once the data layers have been cleaned up and prepared for analysis, I will add a new field to their attribute tables and assigned it a numeric value to reflect the variable suitability for coral survival. All data layers will then be converted to rasters, which will have a map algebra applied to add their suitability values and create a final suitability layer. The results I anticipate to get from this project include the identification of ideal locations in the Florida Keys for future coral reef restoration projects, the exploration of environmental suitability parameters for coral survival, and the introduction of GIS methodologies into coral reef restoration efforts. The proposed timeline for this project is for the next 2 months through June. I will clean up and prepare the data for analysis. Starting in July, I will begin the site selection analysis. And then this fall, I will complete the write-up and present my results. Any questions?
All right, thanks, Matt. That was a great presentation. When folks start writing questions, if you look in the chat window, they should pop up there. And then if you could read the question before responding, that'd be great. So until folks start writing questions, I'll pose this. What was the motivation to get you interested in studying coral?
I've always been interested in coral reefs ever since I was a little kid. I've never really lived near the ocean, but we visited pretty frequently when I was a kid. And been scuba diving a few times, snorkeling in the Caribbean and out in the Bahamas. And I just really love corals, love the ecosystem, all the interactions of the various species in there. And I'm very passionate about the natural environment in general and restoration, conservation. I want to make certain to protect our natural resources for future generations.
All right. Well, thanks for the answer. Looks like you've got a couple of questions in the chat window.
Okay. Do you have a plan or concept how you can determine the accuracy of your estimates? As of right now, no. I'm kind of dependent on the data that is available online. I have made a few contacts with people to kind of receive additional data and kind of get some feedback from people who are actually doing this kind of work. Unfortunately, the responses have not been very great. I haven't really gotten a whole lot of response. So I'm still kind of working that through. Have you thought about seasonal changes in sea surface temperature and how to deal with it? Yes, I have. So I've been looking at when looking at sea surface temperature, I was looking at it throughout the year. And what I'm most interested in is the variation from high to low throughout the year, since it's sea surface temperature stability that is most important for the coral survival. I will be focusing in on areas that show the greatest stability year round in terms of their sea surface temperature. All right, what do you think are the biggest hurdles here that you'll need to overcome to carry this out? It's a good question. I think there's a number of different hurdles that I definitely need to overcome. One thing is I feel like my methodology needs a little more refinement. I'm still struggling with how exactly to incorporate the currents, ocean currents, into my data, and how exactly I'm going to make use of that within the context of a GIS. I've got some ideas, but I'm still kind of mulling it over at the moment. Two measurement issues: what grid cell, raster size, and second, are the data layers equally weighted, or are others more important than others? That's a good question. For raster size, I have not decided that yet. I need to kind of look more at the data and see what the precision of the data is. See what grid cells make the most sense with the data that I currently have. As far as the data layers being equally weighted, some are more important than others. So I haven't quite figured out the exact weighting system yet, but I do believe that the ultimate system I settle on is going to weight certain parameters higher than others. Okay, have you looked into the suitability tools in ArcGIS? They can help compile data and establish your criteria for site suitability. I believe there are some in ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Online. Not sure about ArcMap. Might be something to check out. That's a good idea. Thank you. I have not looked into that. I'll make certain to do so. Thank you. Have you considered any other ways to combine your suitability layers? You mentioned map algebra, likely raster calculator. Yes, yeah, raster calculator. But have you thought of weighted overlay or fuzzy overlay? Based on my capstone project, fuzzy overlay could be good for you since it adds some flexibility for errors and has hard cutoffs in the boundaries of your data. That's a good idea. I had not considered that, but yeah, that could work well. Thank you. All right, did you say where your bathymetry data was coming from? I like this website has inventory of what's out there. Let's see, did I have bathymetry data listed here? No, I did not. The bathymetry data, it came from, oh gosh, I can't remember now. I believe it was oh, what was it? I believe it was something related to a United Nations organization. Yeah, I'll take a look at the NOAA.gov. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks again, Matt, for the presentation.
Yep, thank you.
And let's see, next up, we have Katie Sear. So Katie, if you could start sharing your screen, I'll let you know we see your presentation.
Y'all see
All
it
right.
now?
Yes, we can. And we hear your audio. So our next presenter is Katie Sear, who's going to be talking to us this evening about planning and implementing a GIS-based asset management system for local government, moving from a reactive to a proactive approach for stormwater pipes. Katie, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Katie Sear, and I will be talking with y'all today on my proposal for planning and implementing a GIS-based asset management system for stormwater pipes. To start, I would like to acknowledge and thank my advisor, Professor Steiner, for his guidance throughout this process. So my project will follow the city of Fort Worth and model a shift from a proactive to reactive approach for managing stormwater pipes. So a reactive approach kind of follows this general flow that we show on the left side. Something breaks. In this case, we have a cave-in or a sinkhole, and then emergency repair is required. So that can, of course, be minor or major and range depending on a lot of factors such as the location, the size of the sinkhole or pipe or the infrastructure that's underneath the ground and kind of so on. So a proactive approach, which I plan to model, will follow an extended process flow, which would help to better plan and make asset-based decisions rather than emergency-based ones that we typically see in a reactive approach. So what is asset management? So kind of the textbook definition of asset management is that it's a continuous process that guides the acquisition, use, and disposal of infrastructure assets to optimize service delivery and minimize costs over an asset's entire life cycle. So common examples of infrastructure related assets are manholes, inlets, and pipes, but this concept can also be extended to other non-infrastructure areas such as like IT or other non-physical assets such as a series of companies multiple companies. So the typical practice of asset management can be simple or complex, but generally it follows a cycle that provides the owners or managers more information and tools to make data-driven decisions. So this also helps to maximize use of funds and then from an infrastructure standpoint, achieve sustainable infrastructure goals. So what is a stormwater system? So a stormwater system is a network that conveys water runoff and is comprised of assets like pipes, manholes, inlets, and channels, for example. So a stormwater system can be a separate network on their own or can actually be combined with water or sewer. And that just depends on the city or location. So for the case of the city of Fort Worth, the stormwater system is actually a separate network from water and sewer. So their network has over 900 miles of stormwater pipe, 27,000 inlets, and over 7,000 manholes, kind of just to give you a few names of asset types and kind of to set the general scale related to the stormwater infrastructure for the city. And so these assets are all either owned and or maintained by the city. So what is a cave-in or sinkhole? So a cave-in or sinkhole is defined as the collapse in ground surface. So a cave-in or sinkhole, they're common across the US, and states with the highest number of sinkholes are Texas, Alabama, Florida, and Missouri and Kentucky, just to kind of name a few states. The image on the left is actually a sinkhole in Florida, and then kind of our image on the right gives you kind of an idea from the USGS that shows the areas that are more prone to sinkholes or cave-ins based on their surface geology. So cave-ins can also occur from a human element, such as urban infrastructure like pipes, or some sort of combination of natural and human element. So these occur in areas of heavy rainfall, urban areas with underground infrastructure, like a sewer or stormwater pipe, and areas with limestone or that car subsurface. So we can also see cave-ins or sinkholes occur in waves surrounding severe or extreme weather. So a more recent example for Fort Worth that some of you might have actually heard about in the news a bit was related to the extreme snowstorm that hit Texas several months ago. So this storm resulted in a record number of water main breaks for the city of Fort Worth. There were somewhere over 700, along with somewhere around 900 street repairs related to that collapse in infrastructure. So a number of those, of course, resulted in cave-ins, or they were repaired, one to fix the issue, but also to prevent a preventative measure for those future cave-in potentials. So for the urban element, this can be something as minor as the image on the right, or more severe cases as shown in the middle and left images. So the first image actually engulfs an entire three-way intersection and involves a water pipe infrastructure. So the center image was estimated to be about a 20-foot by 12-foot sinkhole at the surface and was caused by a stormwater pipe collapse from heavy rainfall. So the image on the right is a small early stage of a sinkhole in the roadway. And there's as we can kind of see from the image, there's just a start of a small hole, and then that surrounding area is beginning to sink. So at this stage, the site is being evaluated and the cause is still undetermined. So why is this important? So this is important because these scenarios are, one, unpredictable, and they can also be very costly and hazardous. So a cave-in or sinkhole can happen at any point and addressed as the issue occurs, whereas a proactive approach has advantages of identifying faults before an emergency may happen. So this image actually in the center is an intrusion of an unknown utility pipe through a stormwater pipe. And so the map on the right is actually showing the aerial view of the area. So the dashed orange yellow line is actually that pipe in between each manhole and is associated with that still image in the center from the CCTV. So as we can see from these images, this is a geospatial problem we can't see from the street view. So these images are a series of paperwork order tracking along with several stacks of work history, which unfortunately in most cases are left stacked on desk or filed in cabinets likely to never be seen again. And then we have a series of paper maps and map books which reference typically an outdated map scope. So this example or similar can be found in some form or fashion across many entities. So this is definitely not a good example of a best practice. So this map here on the right is showing unconfirmed cave-in calls to the City of Fort Worth Street Department. So there have been about 1,000 calls to the street department since 2011. So how this information comes in, and cave-in calls are reported several different ways. They can feed in from different departments depending on how an issue is described. But most cave-ins or sinkhole related calls make their way to the street department first, and then additional departments are contacted as specific infrastructure related to that call area is confirmed and identified. So the focus of this project methods are around the design and users, but I felt it was also important to note there are other aspects such as a full GIS inventory collection and data quality control and assurance, project management, of course, and then process implementation that really sets those foundational aspects. So for the case of the City of Fort Worth, they worked with a consultant to develop their database design and collection and their data quality control and quality assurance processes. So underground infrastructure assets are mapped from plans and then kind of continue to be maintained this way. So for my project, I proposed to model the implementation of a proactive approach for stormwater pipe inspections, and then develop a set of best methods for pre-observation and inspection to prepare a pipe for CCTV, the actual pipe CCTV, and the associated GIS design and data collection for CCTV. So the model will demonstrate a specific example for stormwater pipe that follows that proactive model. And the output will identify the pipes, the spatial attributes, the CCTV attributes, as well as the type of pipe, CCTV camera, and then the general geographic limits. So my goal is to analyze and compare an associated pipe repair and complete a general comparison of emergency versus routine repair as it relates to the repair time. So with these results, I also plan to design a training field manual draft and then model like the typical business process flow. So my expected results or assumed results would be that the stormwater pipe inspections and CCTV process would identify faults in the pipe, and from identifying these issues have associated time and cost savings, as well as reduce the potential of cave-ins and then reduce potentially the level of repair. So this project will not directly address repair costs, as this can kind of greatly vary and it's kind of falling outside the intended scope of the project, but I'll aim to show the relative cost comparisons. And then also for teams in the field, this would also provide access to more data in the field, provide a digital map format, and then assist with work and job management. So for my project timeline, I plan to finalize my research and conduct studies over the next 6 months, and then present my final project to Penn State peers in 596B in fall 1 of 2021, which ends in October. And then I plan to graduate in December of 2021. So here's a list of my references for this presentation and major resources. So if you have any questions related to this or my presentation, feel free to contact me with my info on the next slide. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks, Katie, for that great presentation. Wait for questions to come in. You'll be able to see those in the chat window. While we're getting questions coming in here, I had a question on, you had the one slide that showed you a utility pipe that had entered into the sewer system. I assume this happens on a somewhat frequent basis. And probably in many cases, no real harm is done, but when something does go wrong, who ends up paying for that?
It's typically the city that pays for it. It sort of depends on what causes it. There are times I think that other groups get involved, but for the most part, the city covers and repairs the problem or consults with contractors.
So yeah, even when a private contractor is the person or individual that makes the mistake, it falls on the city, huh?
A lot of times it does.
Yeah, all right. Looks like you have a question in the chat window.
Let's see, it says, I congratulate you on this important project. Did you consider including a capability to predict sinkholes? Not exactly. I think in identifying that there's an issue that's before it happens, I think that's a way, or I see that as a way to kind of do those predictions, but not in terms of an analysis. I hope that answers the question. So let's see. So have you found examples of other utilities or industries using a similar methodology for proactive management? Might be interesting to see how they are doing it and to compare your approach. Yes, I found a few and it kind of it's a little bit hard to compare just because I haven't found an exact example that matches how the city of Fort Worth is set up. A lot of the ones I have found are more related to those combined systems where your storm water system is combined with water and sewer, and that kind of falls under another set of guidelines. They have certain standards that they have to follow, where stormwater pipe systems that are separate. From my research so far, they kind of follow the same standard, but then from there they can actually, since it's not 100% the same, they kind of adapt that. They kind of follow that standard and then adapt it to what fits them. So, let's see. So a very practical applied problem. I was thinking of repeat occurrence at a site, not prediction. Okay. Yeah, I think you could. That's a good point. You could do that. I think it would kind of depend if the, so for that case of that still image where there's a pipe intrusion. So once that's found and that's repaired, the pipe's either repaired or it's completely replaced depending on how much damage there is. But typically would not see kind of that event occur necessarily at that same spot if that problem was resolved. But it can vary. There's all different ways a repair and stuff can be made. So not a question, but I like watching those augmented reality videos that show the user with the goggles on the pipe utilities and the street. Yeah, I do too. And then it says, I wonder if Penn State will send me some goggles to play with when it comes to my capstone. Yeah, that would be neat. I think that's it so far.
There's one more question popped up.
So could you add a layer to your analysis to show how sinkholes do not or may not occur as often in areas near water retention ponds or daylighted streams, etc.? I'm not quite sure I understand that. I'd have to kind of look into to see if there's any information that kind of shows that they're less likely to occur. But we do have retention pond, or I do have a retention pond and then a stream data set, but I haven't looked at it as far as relating it to sinkholes related to the infrastructure.
All right, well, thank you again, Katie, for a great presentation. And our next presenter is Kyle Grimsley. So, Katie, if you can stop sharing, that'd be great. And Kyle, we can see if you can get your presentation to share. All right, we can see that, so that's good.
Great, and can you hear me okay?
And we can hear you just fine. So our next presenter, although, our next presenter is Kyle Grimsley, who's going to be talking to us this evening about a methodology and Python software package for evaluating routability of road networks. So Kyle, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. Thanks, I'm Kyle. Good evening. My project is a methodology and Python software package for evaluating routability of road networks. This topic is intentionally fairly heavy on the software development side, which is the direction I was looking to go in to build on my experiences in the Geog 485 and 489 Python courses. It's also in line with my career, where I'm working with this type of data for a defense contractor. And from my personal experience, in this work, I've seen that road network data sets are consistently incomplete when it comes to information needed for accurate routing. And it's an endless, multifaceted effort for the military to try and fill in these gaps in their data. So the question I'm attempting to answer is, how can the routability of a feature dataset road network be efficiently and effectively assessed? The type of things I'm referring to here are size and weight restrictions, especially on bridges, speed limits, directionality of one-way streets, steep gradients, and other similar parameters, anything which can cause a route to not be viable for a vehicle. There are a lot of tools available for validating the geometry and topology of road networks, but not so much when it comes to attribution. A manual process for doing so might involve a combination of select by attribute queries on attributes of interest, or generating a custom report of the database contents to pick through. Given the relative difficulty of that kind of validation, there is sometimes an inherent assumption that the existing data is sufficient for generating routes, which may often be the case, but the outcomes can be very regrettable when the route is not viable. Here we have a rental truck, which was overly optimistic about fitting under this famously unforgiving bridge. And here's a military convoy vehicle which got stuck. So there's understandably a lot of interest in making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen. What I'm proposing is to develop a script which identifies and evaluates key routing attributes in a data set. So given an established set of routing attributes, it would attempt to locate those attributes in the data set and go through each feature to check and see which of those attributes are populated. Then it would generate a report of completeness metrics for the data set, as well as output shapefiles corresponding to each attribute containing the geometries of the features with missing values. This is, of course, only a partial solution to the larger problem, but I think it's a good place to start to be able to more efficiently evaluate the current data holdings. So the first goal for the project is to develop this script. And the second is then to do a case study of sorts by evaluating some sample data sets, both as a proof of concept for the tool, and then to be able to comment on the strengths and weaknesses of available data sources. Looking at the literature for this topic, much of the vehicle routing work ties back to a short 1959 paper by Dijkstra, which he humbly called A Note on Two Problems in Connection with Graphs. And this work later came to be referred to as Dijkstra's algorithm. And this is really it. It's effectively just a kind of iterative solution for testing the possible paths between 2 points to find the shortest one. Now, that little piece of logic has since been at the heart of a variety of applications. The most common are variations on the vehicle routing problem, or VRP, such as delivery driver route optimization. There are dozens and dozens of studies with various improvements on the VRP to fine-tune these solutions to get those UPS drivers to their locations a little more quickly. I came across several other diverse studies around the globe, ranging from firefighting to snowplow routes to mail delivery. And much of the work based on Dijkstra is principally mathematical, as the original work was. But some of the more recent studies do include consideration of some real-world routing constraints, such as surface type, turn restrictions, and speed limits. So I was curious why I wasn't seeing more research leveraging the full range of GIS information for vehicle routing. What I found is some work indicating that integration of GIS capabilities into transportation analysis was a kind of surprisingly slow process. I was finding studies which came out even into the late 90s, which were calling for a more consistent use of GIS and spatial elements in routing. Some reasons why that might be the case are the variety of different data models and standards for transportation data, along with the very large size of many of those data sets, which might pose an obstacle for transitioning data holdings into a GIS. And then also the lack of homogeneity between network links In other words, that road attributes can change between nodes, and so that can make it more complicated to represent the data accurately. But as technology has continued to improve since these studies, these issues have become less limiting with better schema translation capabilities, improved processing systems, and techniques such as linear referencing and dynamic segmentation for accurately representing networks. The paper that most directly hit on my interests was Peter Keenan's Modeling Vehicle Routing in GIS. Keenan stated that traditional views of the routing problem have tended to emphasize the vehicle and location constraints without paying much attention to path constraints. I read that and thought, thank you, glad it's not just me. He listed out these 6 categories of GIS-based path characteristics, which he recommended accounting for in vehicle routing problems. And on top of that, he also emphasized that the data needs to be complete and accurate to leverage these effectively. And we know that is often not the case. So where is real-world vehicle routing with these types of restrictions actually being done? Well, commercial trucking companies and military organizations are 2 of the main candidates, but neither is motivated to make their data and research publicly available, unfortunately for me. One place where we do see this work being done is for oversized and overweight vehicle routing on behalf of state permitting agencies. Zhu et al. Found that highway networks in a state include roads of varying widths, turns that may be infeasible for large or long vehicles, bridges with insufficient weight carrying capacities for very heavy trucks, and underpasses that limit the height of tall trucks. And so states are motivated to protect their infrastructure. So they've put effort into making these permitting processes robust to identify these potential issues. That kind of route analysis for oversized and overweight vehicles traditionally relied on manual checks against engineering diagrams for each bridge or tunnel or potential obstacle. But lately there are software solutions which help automate that process given the required supporting information. And that's definitely encouraging progress, but this is also a fairly niche environment, as on the whole, the literature, from what I found, indicates kind of insufficient attention on real-world routing restrictions, as well as insufficient methodology for assessing the attribution which supports such restrictions. So this project is going to be best served by having a variety of sample data sets to test and compare. And these are the ones that I've looked at so far. So OpenStreetMap is kind of the clear choice for easily accessible road data. The US Census Bureau Tigerline shapefiles are another commonly used option. However, I learned while digging into the OSM contents that all of the Tiger data was actually previously imported into OSM back in 2007 and has since been added to. So the Tiger lines are probably not going to be worth using separately. Another open source option that I came across was the Utah AGRC street network, which is a state network which is pretty well maintained and includes some measures of travel impedance. And then, as discussed previously, much of the higher quality, more complete data is proprietary. And so I was hoping to use some sample data from Esri's ArcGIS Street Map Premium product. However, based on my preliminary testing, when I was able to get access to some of that data, it appears there may be kind of insufficient control for manipulating the data to be able to use it the way I need to in the code for this project. However, there is a sample data set of HERE map data available, which is a leading source of commercial road data and is also forms the basis for the Street Map Premium in the US. So it's a good replacement. Taking a quick look at the 3 data sources which I'm currently targeting. The OSM data, the location is flexible since it's readily available anywhere. And so I'm planning to use corresponding study area to each of the other sources to be able to compare and contrast. So this is just a zoomed in example here. The OSM data, the format comes as a single shapefile, and most of the routing information is actually contained all within the other tags field when populated using these individual tags, which I'll touch on a bit more later. The Utah HERC dataset covers the state of Utah. The road data is stored in a feature class, in this case, within a file geodatabase. And they represent all of the data with a single feature type, with the exception of limited access ramps, which you can hopefully see split out here in the table of contents. These are all just sort of the things that I'm going to have to think about as I figure out how to handle the structure of these data sets within the tool. And this data set has a one-way code field for directionality, and it has a posted speed limit field, as well as some other sort of impedance values that they've calculated, which could be worth looking into. And then the here map data, this data set covers Ramsey County, Minnesota, and most of the road data is stored within a streets feature class. However, there are additional feature classes in this case with some supporting information, such as the Z levels, which indicate relative feature elevations. So the data includes speed limits, and it indicates the presence of bridges and tunnels, although it does not provide associated size or weight restrictions, unfortunately. Here actually has a separate trucking data product where they provide more of that information, but I was not seeing any sample data available from that. So the analysis is going to have three main steps. The first is going to be more of this data exploration in ArcMap. Focus is going to be on understanding the ways in which the routing attribution is stored, as briefly touched on in the preceding slides. And the idea here is that by using a few different sources with different structures to design this tool, I can hopefully build in flexibility to support some other similar schemas as well as the ones that I'm actually testing here, with probably some assistance needed from the user. So as far as the code for the tool, it's going to be written in Python to leverage the ArcPy module. I'm not going to get too much into the coding detail right now. I'm happy to talk more to it later, but I will cover a conceptual flowchart and a couple interesting snippets in the next couple slides. And then the last analysis step is the sample data evaluation using the completed tool to compare and contrast OSM with the other data sources. So this is a concept diagram that I put together for the tool, reflecting some skeleton code that I have sketched out thus far. And so starting with an input data set, it's first going to identify the routing attributes by assessing the data structure and then applying some regular expressions to attempt to match keywords or abbreviations in field names. That's going to be, more or less successful depending on the data set. So then we're going to have a user decision point where we present the identified matches. For example, posted speed limit would have been pretty easily flagged as containing speed limit values. And then the user can either accept the proposed field as corresponding to the attribute which it's listed as representing, or they'll be able to edit the selection to sort of manually choose the proper attribute and then have that change propagate back to update the identified attributes held by the script. So then we'll take that information, build an attribute dictionary by just iterating through each feature and storing the value for each of those identified attributes along with the geometry, and then using all that information to build out the outputs of percentages of completed values and the graphical display of where data is missing. Just a brief aside here on regular expressions, since they're going to be one of the driving forces for building flexibility into the code, which is one of the more complex aspects that I'm looking to take on here. Regular expressions are a construct in many programming languages which aid in locating character sequences within a string. And so in the way I'm using it, in the most basic case here, which it's hardly even needed for, but it could be used to look for the word tag, for example, within a field name, and that would find the other tags field, and therefore I could identify that field likely held more tags, and I would need to process that in a certain way. And then the more complicated scenario here is pulling out the values of the individual tags from within that other tags field, which in a sense, those tags represent what would normally be unique fields probably in another data set. You can see each tag and value pair in this sample of this attribute table here are separated by an arrow made up of an equal sign and a greater than sign. And so, for example, to find the one-way values, I would, as shown in this little code sample on the upper right here, look first for a character group which contains the word one way, followed by any number of non-word characters. And then I'll follow that by a second group looking for any number of word characters. And so that, in this case, would return these yes or no values from within the attribute table in that second group. So that's how I'm going to use that to both try to identify the right fields and then pluck the information out of those fields when it's more buried in there. So these aren't too bad to work with when you're looking at the data, but it's going to potentially be more difficult to anticipate the appropriate expressions to use for more generic data sets. So that's one of the things I'm still sort of figuring out here. And that brings us to the challenges for the project. The first big obstacle is this variation in schemas in terms of how data sets are structured and how attributes are named and organized. I'll be able to account for the variation in the sample data sets that I'm testing with, but realistically, there are likely to be other schemas for which the tool performs less well. And I'm hoping to build in a large amount of control for an experienced user to be able to kind of dial things in for troublesome data sets and get to the right information so that this can all process correctly. But that's in some ways a stretch goal for the project. So I'm going to focus on getting things working up front before I try to build in more of that advanced flexibility. And so the second challenge is just the difficulty of finding high quality routing data. Just at a glance from what I've shown here, you can tell there's not going to be much in the way of size and weight restrictions for vehicles in these data sets, which are a big part of what I'm after. But it's still, I think, potentially useful to highlight those deficiencies and to have this tool, which could be leveraged by someone looking to fill gaps in a more complete data set, for example. So for my anticipated results, I expect to have the script fully functional, at least for the sample data sets, and hopefully with some broader schema support. And then in terms of the sample data evaluation, I'm expecting to see low routing attribute population overall, with better results for things like the speed limit and the one-way attribution, which are a little easier to fill in than for size and weight restrictions, which tend to take a little more of a grind to get populated in these data sources. And so there may also be some other trends which jump out, such as a spatial variation between urban and rural areas, particularly in crowdsourcing data sets where there tends to be better population in urban areas. And so it'll be interesting to see what else comes out there. As far as the timeline, I am not planning to graduate until next spring, 2022. So my rough timeline is to spend the summer continuing to explore the data and do the initial tool development, then spend the fall using the tool to analyze the data sets, refine the tool to be more robust, hopefully, while taking my final elective course. And then I plan to spend the winter into spring completing the case study, writing up the results, and presenting the project. And one possibility I've looked at thus far is the Esri Dev Summit next spring, which would be kind of an ideal scenario to present at if everything goes according to plan. So I've spent a lot of time the past several weeks thinking about this project and how to approach it, but I'm still finding my way in some aspects, so I really appreciate any other perspectives. And to that end, I would like to open it up to questions or comments.
All right, Kyle, thanks for a great presentation. Very interesting. You should probably see some comments or questions come up in the chat window. And as they do, if you could read them before responding, that'd be great.
Definitely.
One question I had about your data. I know that you're focusing a lot on the structure of the road network. Have you considered looking at accident data as a way to perhaps fine tune the way your model is working? One of the resources from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics provides a huge inventory of truck accidents across the US.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah, that may be something for you to look into. So it's bts.gov.
BTS.gov.
Yeah, and they have just a huge amount of data related to accidents, specifically with the trucking industry.
No, I hadn't considered that at all. And I could see using that to kind of identify locations to say, do I have any information here or not, and highlight those where information was missing. So yeah, thank you for that.
Even as a way to help your routing system say, okay, well, this is a bridge that's known to have accidents. Don't go here, right?
Yes, yes. That's great. I had not considered that avenue at all. So that'll be something interesting to check out.
All right. Looks like you have a question already in your comment.
Yes. Hi, Kyle, nice work. Maybe I missed it in your talk, but how do you think you can take into account changes to routing attribution over time? For example, if you do these comparisons multiple times in the year ahead. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's in my career work as well. That's one of the things the military is always struggling with, is they go through these big projects to get these various data sets conflated to kind of get the latest accurate data. And, you know, by the time they do that, they're already a year or more behind, and it's this cycle of like trying to keep data updated. So in my case here, I'm going to be very dependent on the data sets that I'm running the script on. And so I think I'm kind of passing that issue off to whoever's maintaining those data sets and just saying, you know, run the script on your data to help figure out what you might need to fill in or validate, but it's really only a supporting mechanism and not taking on the brunt of that, keeping the data up to match real time, which is not an easy issue to tackle for sure. But good question, thank you. And then we have sort of a follow-on, or areas to avoid if they are prone to accidents. Oh, sure, yes, in reference to the accident location. That's great. Yeah, I'm definitely excited to look at that accident information, see if I can bring that in. Okay, how are you handling the mapping between each schema? It sounded like there was a common schema being defined and users were manually assigning keys, fields from each data set to that common schema. So the way I'm handling this is I'm trying to kind of build into the code the ability to detect what's in how the schema is structured, and then let the code handle that on its own as much as possible. And so, for example, where we have the OSM, the data set is a single shapefile, whereas in some of the other data, there were feature classes within a file geodatabase. And so when the code reads the input source, it's going to check the data set type and say, okay, this is just a shapefile. I'm going to process this in a certain way by knowing that there's only the one shapefile to contend with. Whereas if it's a file geodatabase, it's going to say, all right, I'm going to look at all the feature classes first within this file geodatabase, try to identify which feature classes are relevant, and then go within those to try to pick out the routing attributes. And so then to get down to the attribute level, that's where I'll be using the regular expressions to try to say, okay, one of the things I'm looking for example, is a width of a bridge or a road. And so it might check for things like WID or width or other variations on that theme. and run through each field to try to see if I could match that word or abbreviation and use that to sort of pick out the fields. And then so the user aspect is, that's going to not always pick out everything because there's just a lot of variation in how things are structured. So then it'll be passing that to the user saying, hey, here's, for the width field, this is what I found, or I found nothing. And now here's your opportunity to, from say a combo box drop down of all the field names, pick out what you actually meant it to align to. So best case scenario, it takes very little adjustment from the user. In other cases, they may need to adjust a fair bit, but hopefully we'll at least have the flexibility to allow that to happen. So thank you. Good question. Another one, I think you're right that the best routing data is probably with commercial vendors. I know that some states, Pennsylvania in particular, have contracts with data providers like TeleAtlas to get data like this for internal purposes. Wonder if you might be able to find someone in your area who has such a contact that you may be allowed to use, or if you reach out to the vendors directly to see about educational licensing of some sort. Zillow is an example of a data provider that has some educational research use allowances. That is a great tip. Definitely, I am hoping I can find a couple more good sample data sets, because I think that would really just help make the tool better and help make the project kind of more successful and interesting overall. And so, yeah, any kind of avenues like this, I'm very interested in pursuing. And so, as Esri's education team can help make contacts with data vendors, I'll be happy to make connections. That would be awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I reached out through a couple avenues to try to get the ArcGIS Street Map Premium connection set up, and I kind of maybe got a little too focused on that, and then it seems like it's maybe not going to be the best thing after all. So I'm very interested in tracking down a couple other data sources, and definitely appreciate any support and contacts for doing so. Thanks for raising that up.
Well, thanks again, Kyle, for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And next up, we have Greg Cook. So Greg, if you could start sharing your screen.
Can everybody hear me okay?
You're coming in loud and clear.
Okay. Oh, can everybody see my screen now?
Yes, we can. So our next presenter is Greg Cook this evening, who is going to be talking to us about the geography of lithium and its association to suicide mortality.
So hi, I'm Greg Cook. Here to present about my capstone project. My interest is in the association between lithium and suicide mortality. My advisor for this process is Professor Stephen Matthews. So thank you for him to all his help. So a little bit about me. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, which is the capital of Wisconsin. I work as a software developer for Dane County. And career-wise, I've worked in human services agencies through the state. And human services agencies do many things in Wisconsin, but they provide a lot of direct Medicare services, among many other things. So a lot of my background is in billing and claim automation for Medicaid. So I know a lot about behavioral health in the state. So that sort of is why I have some of these interests. So you might be asking what's interesting about lithium. So lithium is kind of unique. And in this case, we're actually talking about the actual chemical on the periodic table of elements. So it has a pretty unique relationship to behavioral health. Lithium as a compound has been used for treatment for bipolar disorder and major depression since the 1960s. So if you know anything about mental health medications, there's generations of medications, and lithium is very firmly in that first generation, and it's kind of unique that it's still being used as heavily as it is. So it's also pretty interesting because lithium is an actual, chemical in the environment that you can come across, and there's geographical variation, across the globe of the levels of lithium. So this is kind of why I find it's interesting. It's an actual physical impact in the environment on behavioral health. So that's pretty unique. So this aligns well with my interests in behavioral health, and it's a study that you can actually, or it's an idea that you can actually study geographically. So I'm interested in several things with this capstone project. We'll talk about it more in a second, but there's some existing studies that show that higher levels of environmental lithium do actually associate to a decrease in the suicide rate. There's a lot of caveats with that, which we can go into more later. One of the things I'm also very interested in is all of the existing literature focuses on water sampling and data from wells and water sources and so forth. That's a difficult data set to get for lithium sampling. So one thing I'm interested in is if soil lithium levels in the environment are an alternative data set to that, because that's a much easier to access data set. I'm also interested if, in the specifics of can I actually replicate some of the existing literature using that data set. Another issue with the literature that we can talk about some more is it doesn't always affect, or it doesn't always account for the variations of what's impacting suicide. So there's both social and environmental determinants of suicide that are active areas of research of what's causing the actual suicide rate. And then since there's so many things that impact the suicide rate, I'm interested in seeing if we can develop some sort of metric of values to control for when studying lithium versus the suicide rate, so that we know we're actually looking at the effect of lithium. So what does the actual literature on lithium say? So like I said before, it does show that there is an association between an increase in environmental levels of lithium and a decrease in the suicide rate. There's studies going back to about the 1970s that show this, and in the literature review that I did, I found about a dozen articles that cover this. So this, there's not a lot of areas that are heavily looked at, but it has been globally examined. And I found studies in the US, Denmark, Japan, England, and Italy. So almost all of these studies operate at a county equivalent scale, sometimes a city, depending on the study. But they're all aggregating water sources for that area and comparing them to the suicide rate. There's a lot of discrepancy between the studies of how samples are collected and how many samples are used to aggregate for a region. And that's one of the big concerns about these studies. Sometimes they, like this Blumel study at the top, only had one sample for some counties in Texas. So this is a huge region that they're aggregating one value to. So to talk about these specific studies, the study from Blumel and Palmer, these two studies are key to my capstone. They're a study in Texas and Alabama. They're both pretty recent. I would probably be looking to replicate one or the other of them. They both, as I said before, find that there's this association between an increase in the environmental lithium level and a decrease in the suicide rate. They adjust for social and economic concerns differently. So going back to before, this is one of the things I want to control for. The example of Shitsuki and Kabax, these are two studies where there's some problems with them. This one in Japan only accounts for environmental determinants of suicide, and this one from Kabax in England is actually an interesting disproval of the other literature where it did not find this association. And interestingly, it is actually the one that found the lowest lithium levels for the region overall compared to the other literature. Like I said before too, these studies aren't, they're not completely solid when we start talking about the statistics involved. They're inconsistent if they, as to whether they find this association when we start breaking out by sex or gender, or even ethnicity or race. Some of this is probably because there's these limited sampling, but also some of this is because the suicide rate varies dramatically by sex, gender, race, and race and ethnicity. So like I said before, this association is found, the statistical association is weak, and how it's studied statistically does impact a lot of these findings. A big problem is there's no consistent definition of what a significant level of lithium is. It's just greater levels of lithium in the environment correspond to this decrease in the suicide rate. One thing that Palmer's study talks about, and I'm pretty interested in it, is that she suggests that there might be a concentration effect. So there might be a threshold that people have to be consuming before the suicide prevention effect takes effect for people. So one of the problems with this, like I said, is suicide's a very multifaceted issue. People can have biologic-based mental illnesses, but suicide might not be caused by something like that, which is what lithium would be addressing. Like I said before too, those environmental and social determinants that are impacting lithium or impacting suicide are not being addressed consistently across the literature. And all the there's big assumptions being made on whether people are actually consuming this lithium that's in the environment, because we're just looking at water sources. There's no control for if people drink bottled water or things like that. And the sampling for these water sources can be very limited in some cases. So, what sort of project are we talking about? This is something I'd like specific feedback on. My advisor and I are trying to determine at what scale are we going to deal with this project. So we've talked about a number of things. And these are basically the three options that we've looked at. So we could do a national scale analysis, and it's kind of interesting because it'd be reasonably novel. Nobody's done an analysis like this that I found before, where somebody looks at the whole continental US. As with the rest of this project, everything would probably be done at the county scale to match with existing literature and what data sources are available. Another one I'm particularly interested in is doing some sort of transect. We've talked about looking at like the Mississippi River in all the counties along the Mississippi River. I think a transect would be interesting because it would account for a lot of the deviations that you're going to see in the suicide rate by having a lot of variations in wealth and healthcare access and things like that, just naturally included within the data set. And the third option that we've talked about is replicating one of the existing studies, probably the study from Bloom or Palmer in Texas or Alabama. So this image is a picture from a 2017 USGS study of the distribution of lithium across the United States. In this case, this is for the sea soil horizon. So there's, as part of this study, they put out differing levels for 0 to 5 centimeters, the A soil horizon and the sea soil horizon. Lithium differs actually across all of these, but it looks like the sea soil horizon is the most consistent. So, as is pretty clear, you can see variation in lithium due just to the rock and geologic formations. Glaciation's pretty clear. I like this one in Wisconsin because it's very clear that the area in the western side of Wisconsin, which they call the driftless region, which was not glaciated, is impacted very differently than the northern part of Wisconsin. So if we're talking about lithium, like I said before, it's a major medication used to treat bipolar disorder and major depression. Like I said before, it's been around a long time. The first study of it was all the way in 1949. Like I said, it's been used as a medication since the 60s. It has a known anti-suicidal effect. So this is pretty well studied that it helps decrease the rate of suicide for people who are under treatment. One thing about it that I still haven't resolved and want to find out some more about is the actual compound that's used for treatment is usually a compound of lithium carbonate and is not direct lithium. And then therapeutic levels of lithium are pretty high. So there's a whole bunch of literature out there about how do you actually dose somebody for lithium. But usually somebody would have between 300 to 900 milligrams of lithium daily, with 150 milligrams being the lowest reported effective therapeutic dose. So something to think about with this is even at that 150 milligram level, this is, at minimum 1,000 times greater daily consumption for therapeutic levels than for what people would encounter in the environment. So getting into then talking about the geography of suicide, it's something that's changing and even relatively recently, and isn't going to be accounted for with lithium changes. It's going to be the social and environmental determinants of suicide that we talked about before. So in general, lithium has been increasing since '99. It's much higher for men than for women, and then it changes quite a bit depending on age ranges, as well as urban versus rural areas, and even racial breakdowns. So there's these next couple of slides have a couple of charts showing some of those breakdowns. So like this first one, you can see that the male level of suicide is much higher than female level of suicide. And the second image is racial and ethnic breakdowns. So there's a big problem with suicide on Native American reservations. So this is shown here in this race and ethnicity breakdown. And then here's some more detail about the age ranges that the suicide rate is affected by. It's very different for men and women. Again, here you see this 45 to 64 age range being the highest for women, and the 75 and older being the highest age range for men. So getting into specific data sources that we're looking at for this project. One we talked about a lot is CDC Places, which is a very granular data set available about, I believe, 500 cities in the US. It's probably a little too granular. It won't match the existing research, which is largely at the county scale. But it is very detailed about how many things it has data on. There's also sub-state data from SHMSA, which is a big governmental agency on mental health and substance abuse. It may not work well either because they have the data aggregated to health service regions, which are kind of inconsistent in geographical scale. So some places might be to a county, and some places might be to a much larger geographic area than that. Soil lithium levels are actually fairly readily available. Like I mentioned before, there was this study by the USGS in 2017, and they have the whole continental US available. There's also a national geochemical database that USGS maintains that might be used. It has much more granular data, but it seems to align to projects that the USGS has done. So it highly depends on the area if there's going to be any data there at all. Some specific states of Florida and South Carolina, Missouri, Iowa, and North Dakota all have pretty good coverage and might be interesting study areas. So one big caveat with all of this is, is soil geochemical data even going to be a reliable stand-in for water geochemical data? This is something I need to do more research on. I found one study that said maybe. So this is something I'm interested in finding out some more on. Another issue is just how is lithium consumed? And the absorption seems to all be consumption based. You don't seem to pick it up environmentally. I found a study where they literally had people bathe in water that had high levels of lithium concentration in it and see if they were absorbing it through the skin, and you didn't at all. So that's a concern as well. And then, like before, these data sources have different aggregation levels. So there's going to be some data manipulation involved to get these all to a consistent scale so we can analyze them together. Oh, actually go back one. So another thing to add is that some of these data problems or data source problems might become less of an issue over time. The USGS just added lithium to as a chemical of concern to watch this year. And there's also potentially a source data set for USGS well data that I need to look into further. So coming back again to these projects, what are we looking at at implementing? If there's, if people have specific suggestions for things to consider on this project or specific study areas, I'd be really interested in that. I think right now I'm interested in probably doing a transect project, to address some of these variations in things that affect the suicide rate. So in terms of timeline, I'm interested in graduating in December of this year. So I'm planning to complete this capstone project over the summer and develop and deliver a report in the fall. So any questions or comments or suggestions about the project? I'd love to hear.
All right, Greg, thanks a lot for your presentation. That was very, very interesting. There should be some questions pop up in the chat window. If you see a question, if you could read it before responding, that'd be great. One question that I had as I was listening to your presentation, and it's beyond really what you're looking at, but I think it'd be worthy of some thought. You suggested that suicide rates have been increasing over the past several years, and that lithium is a casual association to help reduce suicide rates. Thinking a little bit about the idea of absorption of lithium through the system, have you seen any research that's looked at delivering lithium through public water supplies, kind of in the same way that fluoride is being delivered to help reduce cavities and tooth decay?
I've seen a little bit. I think it's controversial, to say the least.
Sure it is.
I think there needs to be a lot more study, because I don't think the existing literature is there yet to say that whether that's a positive thing to do or not. But there is a couple articles I've read. It's mostly, I think, as to debate the idea. Right now it's not at the level of serious proposals.
All right, well, thanks. It looks like there's some questions coming up for you to respond to.
Looks like it says from Todd Basticow, very interesting research. Do you have any idea as to the accuracy and the precision of the USGS lithium data? It all depends. The National Geochemical Database that we've looked at, there's definitely some accuracy issues there. I know when we're looking at it, there's problems with how they record things. So they have it set up where, like, if values are at a decimal scale, it means they actually weren't able to detect the presence of lithium at the level they were aiming for. So there are some issues there where there'll have to be some cleanup of the data set, to modify some of those problems. The other one, the study from 2017, it does have similar issues where there might just not be enough samples, because they did this at just over 5,000 sites in the U.S. And then they're trying to make a surface for the U.S. of based on all these sampling sites. So it really is, I think, across all of these data sets, this question of how many samples are enough to actually analyze this.
Greg, there was an earlier question from Anthony.
Let's see, I think I missed that. Oh, it says, really interesting project, Greg. Have you considered including mercury, lead, and other potential contaminants as part of your study as well? I'm thinking your spatial analysis would be complemented by including some other chemicals elements to perhaps test the extent to which lithium is a particular explanatory variation or not. We've talked about that a little bit, but I haven't done too much research into it. There is definitely a question, though, of are there other contaminants or elements that are affecting the suicide rate? I haven't come across a lot of research along that, but I'm sure there's stuff out there. I think lithium just has this known effect, and that's why it's been studied. And like I said, I think it's not a huge body of research. It came across maybe a dozen articles that were in reasonable shape for review. I actually have a slide of that. Let me show that. There was two meta-analyses that I looked at, and these are an example from those studies, looking at what the body of research is. And there's only about a dozen studies included. One of the big things here is there's a lot of variation in what level of lithium concentration they were looking at.
All right, great. Well, thanks again for your interesting talk.
Thank you.
And our next presenter is Gerald Shildroth. So you want to start sharing your screen?
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you just fine, and we see your presentation. So whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Professor. Hello, everybody. I am Jed Shildroth, also Gerald. You may see it that way in Canvas or any of the other things. Let me formally, if it's okay with you, professors, welcome everybody to the very last presentation of 596 Alpha for Spring 2. It's almost over. Well, at least the first part of it. So hello, my name is Jed Shildroth, and my project is the automated vehicle detection of high resolution spectral imagery. So, real quick, I'm going to take you through how I'm going to outline this talk. I'm going to start with an introduction, give you a background into some of the information behind my project. Then I'm going to present you with the data that I'm going to use, and then go through an overview of how I'm going to do it, the intended goals and products, a timeline, and a quick conclusion. So I've already introduced myself. My name is Jed, but I am an imagery analyst for the United States Army, and I spend a majority of my time scanning imagery for activity. But national technical means systems must be cued to what they're looking at. You have to be looking at the action and understand it, or else you're just scanning aimlessly for activity. And when this happens, if you have ever stared at imagery the way that I do, if you see a scene, say, of a desert, if you're looking for a car, you will find a car, and it won't be a car. It'll be confirmation bias. You'll actually be looking at a rock or something similar to that. So my intent is to come up with a way that we can find things in a scene without having to spend countless hours scanning that scene. Because when you search for something, you will almost always find it. And when people think of government imagery, they often think of their favorite Jack Ryan movie, you know, with fantastic satellite-based video, which frankly just doesn't exist. Or this image that you see on your screen, which is, thanks to our former president, now declassified, but it's some high-resolution panchromatic imagery. And the truth is that this is a one-off. Rarely does imagery come down in this resolution. And even then, it doesn't have enough information to effectively use a broad detection algorithm to process it. And neither do other spaceborne collection platforms with MSI. If anybody has taken 883 with Professor O'Neill Dunn or any of our other professors and attempted to find a building using a USGS sensor, you will find that that is quite impossible because buildings are just smaller than the ground sample distance that's offered. Oh, sorry, I scanned the wrong way. Give me a second to get back where I was. So another fact to being a defense imagery analyst is that there is just way too much information out there. Roughly 80% of all imagery that's taken goes unexploited or unprocessed. In other words, it's not looked at by human eyes. It's just taken and filed away into a computer somewhere at the MGA. That means that if we spend $4 billion putting a satellite in orbit, approximately $3 billion of it is wasted on photographs that no one ever uses. That's one way to look at it. So we have more imagery than we can look at. We don't have enough imagery analysts to exploit it all. And that leads to a gigantic lapse in the amount of effectiveness that we're getting out of our satellites. So when I said that high resolution panchromatic imagery doesn't have enough resolution to detect or identify detect or identify vehicles, let me be more specific. In 2017, a group of scientists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences attempted a new approach at detecting aircraft in the scene using high resolution panchromatic imagery. The image that you see on the screen is actually from Google Earth. And by selecting a region of interest and then using binarization, where they take the reflectance and it essentially looks, there's only black or there's only white in that image, they were able to identify a new way of processing an algorithm. They called it the corner convex hull approach. and it was 90.9% accurate at detecting aircraft in the scene. Now that was 4 to 8% more accurate than previous attempts at the same thing. However, it's important to point out that this team wasn't intending on finding aircraft in the scene. They were intending on identifying aircraft in the scene. So although for a 90% accuracy, they were able to say to a truth that they were able to locate aircraft within a scene, it didn't perform the way they wanted to in saying that, hey, this aircraft is a Boeing and that one's a McDonnell Douglas, this one over there is an Airbus, and so on and so forth. They wanted to use it for target selection and found that although they were able to identify shapes and classify those as aircraft, they weren't able to say which one. And on top of that, they're choosing the area. They weren't taking a grand image that's 1 mile wide by 3 miles long and putting it through the process to find aircraft. They were actually pointing an image at, say, an airport and asking it to find the aircraft. It's like pointing a camera at a parking lot and saying, look, I found all of those cars. Well, what about if you were pointing at that same camera out at a dirt road? Would it find the car then? And I would debate that it wouldn't. And so my intent is to be able to do this to raw imagery, not specific imagery in the end. I'm not going to take my imagery and say, I can put this in anywhere, but I want to be able to identify spectral properties that may or may not be able to be transferred to larger imagery. So the way that I intend on doing this is more data. And how do we get more data? But by having better sensors. So more precise data. Current air breathing collection platforms like drones or helicopters can carry a sensor that is much more precise. It has better spectral and spatial resolution and is far superior to any of our spaceborne assets, on top of the fact that you have less to deal with atmospheric correction. So I secured 2 small scenes of spectral imagery that contain a very large amount of data. The first is from a Canadian company called Itris Research, and it was taken by their UCASI sensor. It is a 72-band image with wavelengths ranging from 405 to 992 nanometers. It has a 25 centimeter ground sample distance, and it was taken by a helicopter at 720 meters above ground level, roughly flying at 45 knots. The scene is a very suburban, I mean, as you can see from the image, it's just a snippet of it, but it's a suburban area near Big Stone Gap, Virginia, and it was taken, about 2 years ago. The next image that I have was taken by a fellow Penn State MGIS student, Coriel Kelsey, took this last month out in Oak Grove, which is just outside of New Orleans, Louisiana. He did it using a MicaSense Red Edge MX, and it is also paired with LiDAR. So I have precision LiDAR that is not temporally identical, but it is similar. I mean, it was taken within days of one another. I don't know how well that will actually help with the parked vehicles, or it definitely won't help with vehicles that were moving at the time. However, we'll see if it adds any value to the situation. It does only have 5 bands, the red, green, blue, near IR, and the red edge. Its wavelength is from 475 nanometers to 842 nanometers. And the ground sample distance is 1/4 of a foot. Both of these images come with DSMs. They were taken in, they were orthorectified and taken in stereo. So I do have DSMs for both, although I'm attempting not to use elevation data as much as possible, except to glean additional information out of it. This was taken using a quadcopter. It was roughly 360 feet in the air, 120 meters, and he was ranging, he said, between 18 and 22 miles an hour, roughly at the 21 area. So what I intend to do for my project, a couple of steps, is a literature review, which is constantly ongoing, but I've done a majority of it thus far. Gathered the data, which you've seen. I only plan on using 2. I want to keep it small and simple. I'm presenting the plan to you all now. And then I'm going to exploit and manipulate the data for 1 and identify the spectral signature structures. And then I'm going to do it for 2, as well as determine whether or not the elevation and the data enhancements, or excuse me, to determine whether the elevation data has any enhancements that can be offered. I'm going to compare the differences between the 2, maybe to determine which one is better, which one is worse. I'm assuming at the get-go that the 72-band imagery will provide me with additional information that's going to be worth its weight in gold, if you will. But I'm not counting on it 100%. In the end, I'm going to produce some rule sets, some vector layers, and some raster layers, as well as some spectral signature libraries of both scenes, and then present the results. In order to do this, I'm relying heavily on eCognition. I will be presenting a couple of deliverables in Excel format, and then ArcGIS Pro at the moment will probably be the best program for me to do the spectral library. But the intent is to do some pure research, manipulation, and exploitation of the data. I'm looking for cars, trucks, trailers, things that we couldn't pick up with your standard USGS surveying satellite. As an example of how I'm going to go about doing this is your standard ECOG workflow. And for those familiar with eCognition, it really is kind of a crapshoot how you started out, but there's multiple types of segmentation. I assume that I'm going to begin with a pixelized segmentation, but I'm going to try several different methods. And originally, first try through on both sets of data, I intend to do land cover classification for vegetation, roads, and bare earth, and then mask them and see what's left. I expect that I'm going to have some issues with keeping the edges very clean, but once I can do that and extract the metals, I'm going to classify the buildings, pull out those metal buildings and asphalt covered buildings that are not vehicles, classify the vehicles, build some vector layers, raster layers, and then end up with a rule set. Now I'm going to do this minimum 2 times on each. I'm really hoping for 3 or 4 separate rule sets that will get me a 90% accuracy. And on the second time around, I'm going to do it in reverse. So after the segmentation and understanding what my spectral signatures are going to be, I'm going to then ideally start looking for those first without having to go back through and pull out roads, vegetation, land cover to see if that there's an economy of processing that can be achieved by doing it one way as opposed to the other in both scenes. So first way in forward in the logical way that we were taught in 883, and then second way in reverse, and then a third way to see if there's more than one way to skin a cat, if you will. So my main goal is to better understand the spectral properties of high resolution data in order to affect change in how imagery of the future is processed, so that people in my position don't need to spend countless hours scanning imagery for nothing. They can run through a process and things in a scene that may be metallic or vehicles can be highlighted. So I'm going to focus on finding multiple paths to reaching that same conclusion. And I intend to build a classification library for the spectral signatures within both scenes. It's going to be real similar to a land cover classification, but this will include much smaller objects, as small as we can possibly go, and still identify using imagery to confirm that. And I'm going to organize those into graphical representations and probably store them in an Excel sheet of some sort. My timeline, I'm going to take a couple weeks off, but then I'm going to jump into, over the summer, spending 1 to 2 months in developing these algorithms and exploiting my data. Spend 2 weeks playing around with the error calculations and the accuracy analysis. And hopefully fall 1 is when I will be doing 596 Bravo and doing the 2 weeks of peer review and some refinement, writing my paper, presenting my results. Ultimately, I'll have 4 to 6 or more, possibly, algorithms or ECOG rule sets, if you will, that have a 90% accuracy or better. 4 to 6 matching vector layers that highlight the vehicles in a scene, and that'll be part of the rule set, but it will kick out a vector layer in the end. And then 2 spectral signature libraries, a paper, and then if possible, I'll present at an ASPRS online meeting if they're going to have one this fall, or I'll end up at Penn State University MGIS online presentation, as so many of us have over the last year. In conclusion, so if we want to build a cobblestone path, we have to do it 1 brick at a time. And it's my hope that this research might be able to be a small but integral part of improving how we use imagery going forward and the data that's stored within it. My project is not a grand plan to solve the solution today or to be the greatest algorithm or rule set to find vehicles in a scene. It's about what it could mean in terms of somebody else picking up my information, gleaning something off of it and applying it more towards the future. So as important as my deliverable products are, documenting and reporting my methods and the steps that I took and the information that I have discovered may prove to be the most valuable information that is gleaned for future GIS designers and analysts. So that is my project. Does anybody have any questions?
Great job, Gerald. Thanks for your presentation. Wait for some questions to pop up in the chat window. When they do, if you could read them before you respond, that'd be great. So while we're waiting for questions to pop up, kind of going off of our conversation we had before you started the session tonight, who, aside from fulfilling the requirements for the capstone project, who else are you targeting this application for specifically? Is this a military application, or is this outside of that sphere?
I would say it's both. So I have a clearance and I must watch what I say. However, it's been my position since I entered into the Army and began doing what I'm doing that we don't make the most effective use of the resources that we have at hand. We put tons of money into defense, especially into reconnaissance with our satellites up there, and we send them up there and they'll sit there for a year before we even turn them on and figure out how to use them. And that has nothing to do with, you know, ground control and administrative red tape. It's just the fact that people don't understand the tool that is up there. And so if we could take some of this, and even, I mean, with the invention of microsatellites, I'm sure you're familiar with those, but we're going to have better and better sensors going up faster and more with better access to them than we have ever known. And I have a feeling that those sensors will also go unused, or it will provide us with more data that we know what to do with. So why are we putting a sensor that gives us 16,000 bands of spectral imagery up into the sky if we don't know what to do with 5? And so I guess my point in this is let's try and glean some more out of that information. When we're, as GIS professionals, do we step into the realm of those that are using spectrometers to find things at a microscopic level? Because with quantum computing, we're literally less than a decade away from having those types of sensors in spaceborne assets, even faster if they can figure out how to put it into a microsat. Does that answer your question, or did I just go off on a really weird rant?
No. That's a very, very interesting perspective. So thanks for sharing. Looks like you have some questions here in the chat window.
Yep, Dr. B has a question. It says, Jed, this off the direction you're going, but do you see any advantage to using multiple sensors such as spatially referenced cell phone locations? Doc, I am attempting to, I went back and forth with my advisor about this, Professor Schuckman, and there's multiple ways that you could develop rule sets using shapes and shadows and even reflectance, as opposed to, you know, reflectance on a panchromatic scale. The idea is to discover what lies beneath our spectral properties in terms of, say, a spectral signature like a DNA, and shy away from our standard shape texture analysis that we would do with our eyes. Is what are in the bands that we can't see that we can use to our advantage for actually doing identification, because we don't really do that. Even now, what if the computer could automatically tell us that without having to switch it to a false color composite? You see, I hope that kind of answers. So I would like to pair sensors, but at the same time, I want to keep it simple and stay focused on the spectral analysis. Next question. How do you verify the accuracy of each scene? Do you have to manually classify each image and compare them to the results of the ECOG results? Yes, that is my intent. The nice part is my scenes are actually very small. One of them is about 200 meters by 600 meters, and the other one is about a half of a kilometer by a kilometer. However, there's not a lot of, I intend on spending some time. I've already counted the vehicles in one scene, and it's less than 62. And in the other scene, it's going to be much more complicated because there's so many houses, not large buildings, but houses and trampolines and other things. So I intend on using, God's gifts of my eyes to identify how many vehicles, and I will use that to be a yes or no. And I'll probably plot them and make myself a shapefile so that I can automate the process and make it faster. For those of you that like this topic, I suggest taking 883 if you haven't yet. Me too. I had a great time with it, Jeremy. I took it with Professor O'Neill Dunn, and he was awesome. Good job. Thank you. Well, thank you. Appreciate it, Jeremy. And then the last one is from you. So any more questions? There's my references, should anybody wish to see them.
Well, again, thanks, Jeff, for your insightful presentation. A lot of good information there. Want to thank all the presenters for spending their time and giving us all a very interesting evening of talks and ideas. So good luck to all of you, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening, and look forward to more presentations here for the summer. So take care.
Thank you, Professor.